we're going to get right into it. What's going to happen in this panel, we're going to have roughly about 20 to 25 minutes of conversation on the panelists, and then I'm going to open it up to the larger group, okay? And so one of the things that I would like to sort of remind you of what the session is, this is the report in 2015. We're talking about the Moynihan report, and poverty, education, crime, and race. The panelists will discuss the Moynihan report in the context of poverty, education, and crime, and how they interact with issues of race. Panelists will also discuss the political and social context and causes of crime. Our panelists today, the moderator, I am Tonya thames-taylor from Westchester University. And we also have Ms. Rosalyn J. McPherson. She's the president and CEO of the Urban League of Philadelphia. You want to wait for that? Okay. All right, and we have Dr. Kristen Bazley, who's in elementary ed here at the Kutztown. And then we have Dr. Thomas Robertson. And then we have Dr. Albert Fu. And so what we're going to do, how I'm going to sort of set this up, we had a dynamic time at lunch. And so normally I like to sort of give visuals so you can see things and sort of you can get immediately into the conversation with your mind. Because again, what's going to happen is that we'll open it up to discourse because I'm going to get their perspective. And then the conversation is going to be very organic. And then I'm going to open it up to you. So let's look at this chart here right quick. Again, this is really going to throw us right into the thrust of our conversation. Education, poverty, and race. Okay, and so let's look at are our children being pushed into prison, the pipeline to prison. How many of you have heard of this pipeline to prison? Okay, and so what happens is the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and its prisons and jails are overwhelmingly filled with African Americans and Latinos. The path to prison for young African Americans and Latino males are many, but they are starting points and are often school. Their starting point is often school and the foster care system. So let's look at the school to prison pipeline here. So let's just look at the numbers, hardcore numbers. And 40% of students expelled from school each year are black. 70% of students involved in in-school arrest are black or Latino. So this goes back to the idea of law enforcement. So again, you got this pipeline to prison, but I also in the back of your mind want to sort of layer this conversation to think about either conversations like the new Jim Crow or the prison industrial complex. So then we have 3.5 times black students are 3 times more times likely to be suspended than white students. Black and Latino students are twice as likely not to graduate than whites. And 68% of all males in state and federal prisons do not have a diploma, high school diploma. So that's one end, okay? So this is what Moynihan was basically talking about in his report about this cycle that can occur. And on the second hand, we're now looking at, so you got education on one end, and then you have the foster care system. Exactly what's the fallout from there? So 50% of the kids who are in the foster care system in America now are black or Latino. 30% of foster care youth entering the juvenile justice system are placement related. 25% of the young people leaving foster care will be incarcerated within a few years after turning 18. 50% of young people leaving foster care will be unemployed a few years after 18. And 70%, let's just look at how the spill out rate. 70% of inmates in California's state prison belong to the foster care system or their former foster care. So in Moynihan's report, he was basically talking about what the lack of opportunity does and how education spills out. He spelled out that African American females are more likely, or women in non-white communities are more likely to get education than those who are in white communities. And so now the question to the panelists, and also again for you in the audience, what is your response to this? Because again, our panel discussion is Moynihan in 2015. So this was last year, came out last year. And at the very bottom, for example, they talk about the color of incarceration. And they talk about how 61% of the incarcerated population are Black and Latino, and they're only 30% of the population. So there's a complex there. And so therefore, and I will constantly refer to it as the prison industrial complex, I will. It's called the PIC system. And so therefore, 1 out of 3 African American males will be incarcerated in his lifetime. So let's take it and make it visual just like they did. 3 people, 1 of them will be incarcerated. And then lastly, 1 out of every 6 Latinos will be incarcerated. So here's the fallout of education, poverty, and opportunity. So, panelists, let's engage this chart and let's have a conversation. Your initial reactions to this panel discussion.
I'll just go, Dr. thames-taylor, as you talk about the incarceration rates and the prison industrial complex, it actually reminds me of, at least from some scholars' perspective, the ultimate purpose of slavery was to support capitalism. Because Europeans, and I'm talking, obviously, even though we're supposed to be talking about 2015, I gotta go a little bit back. Because Europeans initially tried to coerce their fellow Europeans to work, they needed large numbers to make large industrial means really pay off economically. But there weren't enough Europeans that they were comfortable getting to work harshly and therefore pay them accordingly. So they go out, pluralistically, go to different lands, find groups of people. They have resources, they have man, and in some cases woman power. And then they began to, and this is where the psychology comes in, I won't get into all the details of psychology, but in order to justify potentially taking these folks, putting them to work, but yet these are Christians that are doing this, they encounter what we in psychology call cognitive dissonance. Your attitude about who you are and how you do things is one thing. I'm a Christian, I love my fellow man and woman. But we need to make this money. And we need to get these people, by any means necessary, sorry to paraphrase Malcolm, but I think he'll understand. And what we do is we then say, well, they're not really humans or people like us. So if we can at least rationalize and say they're not really humans or people like us. In fact, anyone please correct me, but if I recall, our U.S. Constitution still holds blacks as 3/5 of a person. Okay, it certainly did when the fathers were putting it together. So the point is that by them justifying people of color as not human, or at least as not equal to the Europeans, it allowed them to still be, God-fearing, wholesome Christians, and enslaving them to fuel mercantilism, which then grew into capitalism. And what I see when you brought up that statistic is it's essentially what's going on here today. In probably every state, certainly many states, if not most states, I'm sure Pennsylvania's no exception, we have privatized prisons. That is an industry. They make money by incarcerating individuals. Are they going to incarcerate, and I'm going to be real here, are they going to incarcerate, John, Hunter, Trigg? I think we have an idea of who those individuals might be in a stereotypical sense. No, because they'll fight for their rights, because how dare you, get me on some trumped up charge of whatever. No, they're going to pick on historically what our culture and the Western world in general has identified as the easier victims. And then there are a variety of, intellectual and political jiu-jitsu tricks that they do to, fill the prisons with bodies that they can then make money off of. Okay. In fact, as I recall, several years ago, there was a panel here, a smaller panel, where my understanding, at least as I recall, was that in a very, very close by city, I won't say the name of the city, the decision was made by the city administrators to funnel money away from education and schools going to the black and brown schools, and to put that money into building prisons or to incarcerate the expected, based on the computer models, the expected prison population. So they funnel money away from education, which we know if a child is educated, the more education he or she receives, the more likely he or she will go on to, if not college, certainly some other endeavor and be productive citizens. But instead, the city administrators decided, nah, the data say that by 3rd grade, they'll probably be somehow delinquent or in the system. Let's put that money, since they're going to be in jail somehow, some way, let's put that money in hiring more police officers or building more prisons. So that, based on your initial question, that's what struck the parallel between the prison industrial complex now and the origin of slavery, at least from the European cultural perspective. My
I can
thoughts.
say from an education point of view, I spent about 10 years working in inner city schools in Tampa, Florida. And one of the questions I taught kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade. And in the beginning, you ask, what do you want to do when you grow up? And one of the things that hit home to me was one year when the kids all looked at me and said, well, what do you need?
Mm-hmm.
And I started saying, well, do you want to be a doctor? Do you want to be a policeman? Do you want to be a fireman? Do you want to be a lawyer? All these different jobs that I kept coming up with, they looked at me and said, oh, but I can't do that. And I said, well, why not? And they said, well, my dad's in prison and my mom works a couple of jobs and she raises babies, and so that's what I'm going to do. And looking at the statistics, and to me that's really sad that our 6-year-olds are thinking that that's just the path that they're going to go on, is that their dad's in jail, so that's where they're going to go. And to me that's very disturbing that at 6, when the world is at their fingertips, where they can do anything that they want, they're thinking that that's where they automatically will go. And I think a lot of it comes back to our schools, and I was talking about this at lunch, is bringing in strong role models for our children so that they can see and they can have those role models, and not just bring them in to talk, actually have them there, have them come in weekly, have them come in monthly, and actually have them be part of your classroom so that you have a role model that they can look at and say, hey, I can do this. I can be a teacher. I can be anything that I want to be, instead of, well, my dad's in jail, my grandpa's in jail, that's where I guess I go. And to me, that was really sad to see that. It definitely changed my way of teaching. It definitely changed the way that I saw, and looking at these statistics, I mean, it falls exactly into where these statistics are.
So I get uncomfortable with overgeneralizing.
Okay.
And I also don't necessarily agree that they can do anything they want to do when they are faced with these kinds of dynamics. So I think that part of what those of us who are in positions of economic empowerment, that's part of, excuse me, what we're charged with doing is providing that kind of hope. Now for me, I was alive when the Moynihan report came out. I'm probably one of the few people in the room who has lived through this. As a matter of fact, I started college in 1970. So I was around for the death of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. I was around for riots. I am a military kid, so I grew up living around the world. Both of my parents educated, so I can tell you that even as a middle-class educated family, I still was faced with many of the same stereotypes and limitations that my undergrad degree is secondary education, so I think I look at this and I say all-around exposure. So just yesterday, I'm with the Urban League of Philadelphia. We are in the midst of our legislative policy visit, so I was on Capitol Hill yesterday, sitting in Senator Casey's office. They're actually drafting a bill that addresses this suspension rate because it is a real problem that so many young people are being suspended as a way of managing them. So I think when I look at the full spectrum of where we were in 1965 and where we are in 2015, while a lot has changed, I think the events of this summer underscore those things that have not changed, particularly when it comes to attitude about our young people. And yes, we've got some real problems that continue to be real, and
the need for solutions, but I have to come from a perspective of hope if I'm going to really lead a charge in this region for economic empowerment, because the job situation in our community is still abysmal. So even though we are in the midst of an economic recovery on the mainstream, it is still very challenging for people of color to go after those jobs, be considered for those jobs, even when they are highly educated. We see these people coming into our career center all the time. It is still very complex and difficult, different set of rules for entrepreneurs of color to get financing from banks. They are not being, the standards vary for a small business owner who's white versus one who is of color, and it's those small business owners that we are counting on to employ larger numbers of people. So I just think it is such a complex situation. And I also look at the fact that the Urban League of Philadelphia will turn 100 years old in 2017. That is phenomenal. And the National Urban League became 100 years old in 2010. So when I look at the history of how the organization was originally founded to help those blacks, mostly who had come in the Great Migration from the South to the North, and it was designed to help them get situated and establish a life. And now what we are charged with doing now, we are still very relevant in this next 100 years when it comes to connecting people to opportunity. And all of these kinds of things are just such abysmal, complex situations. And I also speak as a parent who raised 3 adults, 2 of whom are still living. The male is not living. So my experiences are personal as well as professional when it comes to the attitudes and the things that permeate and the kinds of things that are standing in the way. So I'll stop there for now because I don't want to overdo it here.
Well, I think you're correct on where you're coming from. I'm just looking at it from, we need to start when they're young, so that when they grow up, they have this mindset of, I'm going to go and to do this. And that's where I was coming from as far as the 6-year-olds, the 5-year-olds that I had. To me, it was heartbreaking that they came in with that attitude already, or that idea already. And that's where it needs to change. It needs to change when they're young, so that as they grow, then they can be the leaders to push for more, for this change of this, because this is ridiculous. These numbers, that should not be. So.
I've heard you've used the word mindset, and is this thing on? Okay, it is on. Okay. I've heard you used the word mindset, and I actually heard it used in the previous session earlier in the morning as well. And sorry to be a little bit of a sociologist, but the word mindset troubles me significantly, because there's a very individualistic kind of component to the idea of mindset. And it's not to say that we shouldn't change the mindset of young people so that they can be hopeful and optimistic. But I see many of these problems as deeply historical and structural problems. The topic of this session is poverty, education, and crime, and of course race. For me, what kind of connects all of this is the ongoing legacy of segregation in the United States. The fact that the average American kid that goes to a school where the vast majority of other students look more like them than not. It's, of course, most students go to schools that pull from local communities in which many of those communities are not particularly diverse. And of course, it varies from region to region. We can look at Detroit, Michigan, in which the levels of black isolation in various neighborhoods in Detroit have not changed in the last 30 years. It's actually far less integrated now than it was actually several decades earlier. So for me, even when we talk about issues of policing, we can have diversity initiatives, but if communities are integrated, there's no system of accountability from the community to actually make sure that law enforcement is not just doing their job, but doing a job that's actually fair to all members of that community. In terms of education, as long as we have the level of segregation that we have in the United States today, we're going to have unequal schools. I mean, this goes back to Brown versus Board. I mean, like, separate is not equal, and definitely there's a lot of separation that goes on. And for me, it can't just be education. It can't just be jobs. It can't be just a reform in terms of prisons. It has to be this kind of large-scale sort of structural change that can actually resolve many of the problems that we see here.
After you touched on, go, sure.
And one of the things that I want to talk about, because we got maybe 10 more minutes before we open it up to the audience. And so what happens is that one of the pieces that you mentioned, mindset, and I talked about this over lunch. And here's a scenario I want you to think about. And again, I want the group to respond to this. So I live in a community. I am I am the embodiment of what Moynihan said. I own a house. I am higher income. He said that higher income blacks have a tendency to live in an impoverished area more than poor whites. And I am an embodiment of that. I am higher income in my impoverished community. And so in that, when I first moved to the community, I thought it was very interesting, because what happens is that when something happened in the community, I was quick to get on the phone and call the police. So the kids in the neighborhood and the adults, they start to refer to me as the Po-Po Queen. Because I used to call the Po-Po on everything, right? What? They did it. So what happens is that was very disturbing to them. And what was very disturbing to me is to see young people who were 5 and 6 years old, when the police came, they were running away. So my initial reaction was this: you mean to tell me, I'm Southern, you mean to tell me these folks not train their kids to run away from the police? I just absolutely, and I ain't say police, I said police. And so what happens is that they not taught these kids to do that. I said, that's just absolutely awful. But then I started to observe things in my community. I started to see how people were being stopped, and then next thing you know, handcuffs was going on them. I started noticing that police were going into their homes and coming out with people in handcuffs. So it wasn't anything that they were being taught, but what these 5 and 6 year olds were seeing was trauma. And so therefore, when you're looking at what is the idea of a mindset, if you're 4 and 5 years old, 6 and 7, and you're seeing someone come into your home, disrespect your home, and then bring out someone you love, that is now about survival, that you're running away from the police. Not because you're running to, again, coming up from the environment that I did, we ran to policemen. But in that environment, they ran away, and it started to make sense. And so therefore, the question about how do we sort of deal with, how does this work? How does this idea of how poverty is entitled and for people to make choices? Because that's what Moynihan's report 50 years ago said, that poverty will help people to make choices, and these are some of the choices that they have been made. So with that example that I just gave, let's have some reactions to that.
What comes to mind to me is, again, we had this conversation at lunch. Y'all should have been there. It was really great. Should have been recording it. Is, again, this idea of community policing. My mother is a retired elementary school teacher and vice principal in the Washington, D.C. area. And I remember going to school with her on my days off, Tommy, come on to school, and I'm okay. And I would be exposed to Officer Friendly, who, for those of you who don't know D.C., at least it historically has been an overwhelmingly African-American city in the nation's capital. And so regularly they would have black police officers in the schools so that children could see they look just like you. They probably know some of you or your family. They know your neighborhood. They live in your neighborhood in all likelihood. And the kids were embracing the Officer Friendlies, and at least to some extent were not as fearful of the police, at least back then. I'm talking in the mid to late 70s, 80s, at least in that particular confine. And I think this speaks, to my mind, to a larger issue in that we need to, as Dr. Bazley, I think, was alluding to some extent, we need to have in the schools teachers as well as aides and so on that look like the kids. because from a psychological perspective, children need to see people, not just children, people need to see themselves in the people that they are asking or trying to aspire to be. Otherwise, it may seem alien to them. And too often, I don't know the statistics offhand, but I was reading some stuff, 90% of the black kids that go to schools in this country only 5 or 10% of them have a teacher that looks like them. Okay? And psychologically, that tells them, maybe this isn't for me. No matter how much we try to motivate them and so on, if they can't see that. And then the other thing is, real quickly, and I'll defer to my colleagues here, is that from a pedagogical perspective, there's a bunch of research in experimental psychology. One of my former professors from Howard University, Wade Boykin and his colleagues, with a model called cultural discontinuity. If the learning styles and cognitive styles that are taught and emphasized in the home of students of color, not just African American students, but Native Americans, Hawaiian students, and so on, if it is not valued and in place in the American educational system, it's going to be foreign to them, and they're going to have to learn even more than what the white middle-class kids have to learn, because the white middle-class kids are getting the type of learning and cognitive styles that are embraced and valued in the school system here. So what Dr. Boykin has demonstrated experimentally is that when you allow for things like high movement expressiveness, allow kids to learn in an environment in which they can associate it with music or do a dance and a song with the material, when those kids are allowed to do that, they actually end up scoring higher than the white kids. When you provide a lot of psychological and visual stimulation, those kids are used to having it in their homes, but when you deprive them of that in the classroom where they're only asked to focus on the teacher and on the screen, be quiet, sit down, sit on your hands, yeah, they're going to move around because their brains are used to having variety while they're learning. So in a way, their brains are more sophisticated, I have to say. And I'll just end and say that, but when you take that away from them or don't value that and make them feel like it's bad to want that stimulation because that's helping them exercise their strengths, then they are marginalized and oftentimes identified as ADD, ADHD. And that may explain why we have such a high proportion of black and brown children identified as such, because a lot of times that diagnosis initially is first made based on teacher recommendations or observations. So we need to really evaluate, going from Moynihan, not simply the black and brown folks, but the institutions that they're in, because the institutions don't tend to match the normalcy of the children and the families.
And I think that a big portion of that is that the teachers need to get into know the communities, need to be part of the communities, need to be that friendly, that person that goes to community events, is part of the community, so that you become a friendly face, and that and you also learn the learning styles. You learn, because everybody does learn differently, and you learn how your students learn, and then you focus on that, and that's how you take. And I'm coming from that perspective of I was the only Asian in my classroom, and so I went to all the events. I went to the community picnics. I went and once I started doing that, at first, the parents that I had were very, okay, this person's going to come in here and judge me. And once they realized that, no, I'm not. I'm here because I want to help your child. I want to do the best I can. I want to learn how they learn, what they're learning at home, what their experiences are, and then I bring that into my classroom. Now, I think that as an educator is part of our job, to get to know the students and our cultures, so that we can break down those barriers.
Anyone else like to comment?
Oh, I'll jump in. Certainly, if you're a good educator, these are things that you should be doing, right? I mean, I think that's the obvious part. But to kind of go back to the idea of being involved in the community, and something that you actually brought up, the idea of actually living in that community, right? I mean, this is many of the things that we see with some of the problems with law enforcement. We see the same thing with teachers. They don't live in the communities that they actually work in. Once again, this comes back to the issue of segregation, right? This is a question that those of you guys who have taken my classes before out there, this is you might have actually heard me kind of ask you guys this. When you graduate from here and you become successful, where are you going to live? Are you going to live in a place that's actually truly diverse, or is it going to be a homogenous sort of environment that you're going to live in? You're going to be a young professional, be paid fantastically, right? It might be racially or ethnically diverse, but certainly not going to be diverse in terms of social class. So the big question is, like, how segregated are we going to how does segregation continue to sort of reproduce a number of these inequalities? Because while you're involved in the community, many people will just go home from work. Not educators, but like people who go home and do not actually really integrate into their communities.
Okay. I mean, I will agree
Yeah,
with you on
yeah.
that. However, it is at this kind of position in a college where we are the ones who are letting them know this is what's going on. This is what you need to be doing. You need to be having our students go out into schools and be part of the culture and so that they see.
Yeah.
And realizing that, again, it's not all people that live in a community. That's some people choose to live in the community to get to know, so that they can be part of the community. So it just depends on the person in general.
So these are, again, very complex issues, and there's not a one-size-fits-all formula. So when we send our kids to college, we're looking for upward mobility. So some are going to go back to the community and others are not. And I'm okay with whatever a person chooses to do. I think also when we look at attitudes that permeate, we also need to look at the kinds of attitudes that have been perpetuated on the other side. What a person assumes about me when they first meet me, if they're white, is typically not at all what my experience is, but they make those assumptions anyway. And I also, I even had a board member travel with me on a business trip once, and you get to know colleagues when you're on these trips. And once he got comfortable, he started telling me how he grew up poor and didn't have his first passport till he was 30, and then went on to say, but I'm sure you can relate since you probably grew up the same way. Well, the fact of the matter is I didn't grow up the same way, but I knew from my bilingual training that I better not make him too uncomfortable, that it would be better to gently let him off the hook so that we could further a dialogue. But that kind of stuff still happens all the time. So I was still very angry and upset about Trayvon Martin. He was walking to his own father's house in a community, and somebody made an assumption, erroneous about him, killed him, and got away with it. That is a travesty. That's almost a demonstration that even when you do move into another socioeconomic realm, that you are still not safe because of assumptions. So these are not very easy questions to answer in a 20-minute period. And we have to really do a lot of thinking around here because you've got voting rights celebrations. When you sent me that big, thick packet that made me feel like I was working on a PhD so that I could study again, I mean, I really appreciated having to reacquaint myself with the Moynihan report and read all of the things that people were saying about us and what they still think about us all these years later. These are still challenging times. And again, I point to the fact that I must remain optimistic because I still see some great things. You may have gone into that classroom in Tampa, and I get it. But you know what turns me on? Going to a graduation at an HBCU and seeing all of those families come out to support a young person that got that degree. That's the kind of stuff that doesn't get publicized enough on the news. That's the kind of stuff that would encourage a little kid to go for it. And let's tell them about more than being a policeman, a fireman, and all this stuff. Let's start playing to the strengths that they bring to the table that are going to be varied. In this technological global society in which we exist, there's a lot more to be had. And my last point is this is the only area I've ever lived in, Philadelphia in particular, where they are so worried about people leaving when they get their education. I say go out into the world and get educated about what's out in the world, and then you can come back and have a real positive impact once you've had a broader experience out there. Okay.
Okay, and it's very interesting that we have this, because earlier today we talked about the stigmatized black body. And if you came to earlier sessions, then you heard me say, and I asked, this is an experiment that I do with my students. I said, close your eyes, trust me for a minute, close your eyes. And then I would like for you to tell me, so when you think of Santa Claus, who do you think about? And then I go through these different, elements of asking people, what do they see? And then I said, okay, so you see, so when I say crackhead, what is the image that pops in your head? When I say drug dealer, when I say gangbanger, when I say thug, what are the images? When I say soccer mom, when I say certain words, what are the code words that immediately go into your head? So you're dealing with a stigmatized black body. So therefore, let's just really bring it home to you. Last week, one of the biggest stories on television happened at the University of Oklahoma, well, in the news, right? These weren't people. We're talking about the Moynihan report and its relevance. We're not talking about people who were 60 years old on a bus, in tuxedos, by the way, in tuxedos, and in nice dresses. See, right now I'm trying to sort of help you to settle that image of someone who's in a tuxedo, because with that image, there's normally a level of civility. People dress up in tuxedos to show how civilized they are and they can be. So here you are having young people, roughly in your age group, on a bus, reveling about being able to lynch in order for a person not to be in their space. Right? We will hang a nigger from a tree before he signed with me. So therefore, with that image, and we're talking about the chart that we had here earlier, when we talk about what is perception and what we see, because see, those 18 and 19-year-olds, had they not been caught, would have eventually gone into, the Moynihan reports talk about what a college education affords. These people would have gone into boardrooms, they would have gone into bank rooms, they would have gone into classrooms, they would have gone into police departments, they would have gone into human resources, they would have gone into various places, and their song from college was, before they sign with me, we'll hang them in a tree. And so therefore, the stigmatization that has come from the body, of just the image of a body, that's what happened with Trayvon. That's what happened with the young man who was in Walmart. That was what happened with Eric Gardner. That is what happened when we look at our Oscar Grant, who was just right there, trying to get on the bus. So these, train. And so these type of images. So when we're looking at this chart, I want you to sort of think about it from the panel perspective, because now we're going up into the question perspective with the audience. When you think about a body, what exactly do you think about? When you think about a body, what do you think about? What do you mean by that? When I give you a code word, or because they're code words, when I mention a word, what do you think about? Because if you can go to a man by the name of Gunnar Modell wrote a book called The American Dilemma. And he said that the central part of the American dilemma is that America is in denial about how it sees other people. So now to interrogate self, how do you sort of see these type of images? And so when we look at the prison industrial complex, if you're constantly seeing videos or watching shows like Empire, right, where you basically see these thugs and how they're doing their behavior. And so therefore, if everyone becomes a Lucius, or little Ziggy, or little Wiggy, or little Higgy, or so-and-so and so-and-so, now that was funny, but y'all didn't laugh, right? And so with these little whatevers, so now if that image becomes what you think masculinity is, and now that masculinity could need to be caged, because it's dangerous to a general society. Whereas when you saw young men singing about lynching people on a bus in tuxedos, was it because they were drunk? Okay, so that's the question. We have one more comment, and then we open it up to the audience.
I'd like to just bring that example home with the SAE. Not that I even know if the SAE is on this campus. I don't care at this point. But just last spring, there was an issue here at Kutztown University in Dixon Hall where a series of pictures, handwritten, and this has been thoroughly investigated. Let me just be clear. I've been involved in it. Was posted on black students' dorm doors where there was a tree, an ominous-looking tree, looking down on caricatures of black and Rasta humans, and maybe one, in the far distance of the picture, one white human and an Asian human. But clearly it was focusing, the tree was focusing on the black and the Rasta. And the caption from the tree was, what am I gonna have for dinner? Black. Let's just say that all the people that should have known about it were made aware of it. And let's just say outside of taking their sweet time to find the individuals who were responsible for it, we still don't know what happened to them. Yet the student that found it, the black male student that found it on his door, was traumatized. I've spoken to him many occasions, he's a former student of mine, and his mother. And his mother expressed fear that her son is being targeted and that the university was protecting the perpetrators, who initially lied about why that picture was there and what it was about. They said it was an art class picture. And yes, it was bullcrap. I'm trying to be kind and verbally trying to, I know.
Okay.
You don't know how I roll in class. But anyway, some of y'all
So we got some questions.
But anyway, so the point is, it is here at Kutztown, and yet it still is allowed to exist and not be dealt with by people who should be dealing with it. I'll just leave it at that, and they know who they are.
Okay, now what I would like for you all to do is that this is the part that we really love and engage, and we only got a few more minutes because I know how class ends, okay? And so basically, we're going to have comments, try to wrap up your comments and questions very quickly and succinctly, okay? So I have a comment here, and please raise your hands so I can see. I see a hand over there in the black and white. Anyone else? All right, so I'm going to start here.
Hi, my name is Esther. I just want to make a comment on, the lady with the red dress, I'm sorry. On how she was saying that, she was a middle class, and and I just want to say how I was related to that. So I'm from Nigeria, and I did like so many interviews with students here, and they all like things that I'm like poor and other stuff. So when they interview me, they were like, so where did you live in Nigeria? Do you live on a farm or something? And I was like, I live in the city. My parents, we were middle class. I went to a private school. My parents, we built a house in Nigeria. But people have that assumption of me living on a farm or like living in a poor home or not having enough food to eat. And I was like, that's not even true. And they were like, well, that's what we saw. That's what we see on the television or in the news. And I was like, do you know that Africa is a continent and not a country? Because when you think of Africa, you think of a country, and maybe that's what you saw in other, developing country in Africa. But for me, I didn't go through that. I wasn't poor. I went to a private school. My parents were able to pay for my situation. So when people assume stuff about you or about your ethnicity without not getting to know you, like what she said, she didn't even argue with a coworker. I can't even argue about it. I just like, okay, if that's what you think about me or if that's what you, because you can't change their mind. It's like, I feel like it's just, to me, I feel like I can't even win trying to educate you about my culture, about where I'm from, or like I'm a middle class and I actually was blessed and I had everything growing up. And you already have that assumption in your head without not even getting to know me or about my culture or about my background. So it's really disturbing.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
I do want to tell you that you can change people's attitudes. I do feel that man and I became lifelong friends because we had an open and honest dialogue with each other. So never think that you can't change what people think about you, because with the right delivery you can. And I would like to see more and more of us have open and honest dialogues, because we're going to change this world a dialogue at a time.
My name's Ashley, and very quickly, there was a couple things I want to touch on. One was because right now I'm in Dr. Fu's race and ethnicity class, and we talk about this stuff all the time. And one thing is from 1931 from Scottsboro to 1955 at Emmett Till to 2014 in Trayvon Martin, discrimination happens all the time with colored people, which is a shame. And I think sometimes it's getting better, but it's still not. We're not overcoming every problem. Another thing I want to say is that I think from day one of the country, the whole world, starting, is that people are scared of people who are different. Anybody who's different, regardless of race, ethnicity, on their views on politics, religion, what you identify with. You're gay, you're lesbian, you're straight, you're bisexual. People are just scared of anybody who's different from them. So, which is a shame, because people need to stop insecure and just start treating people the way they deserve, based on everything. Just give people the same respect. So I was that.
Well, thank you so much for that, those remarks, and thank you all for sharing, because it takes energy and it takes courage to share your various stories. One of the things that I do like to tell my students, though, is that I think that one of the things that we've sort of gotten settled to is that people say things like, well, a person fears another person. If you're not careful, that's a veiled way to say it's a level of acceptance. But I don't know necessarily if it's about fear or it's about power. Those young men on the bus, when they were singing and they were reveling, that was power. And Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a struggle. And so therefore, oftentimes what's happened in our discourse is that we've had people to say this. This is the last comment, and then we're going to give a panel, hand clap. But here's the last final comment.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that in 1961, I was named Sweetheart of Sigma Alpha Epsilon. I still had the trophy, and I trashed it.
Oh, wow.
Just so you know. And I've been a member of Southern Poverty Law Center for 25 years.
All right, thank you. Now, let's give the panel a round of applause. Now, thank you so much for coming out. Please let this make you interrogate your ideas. Peace and progress, and the next panel starts in 10 minutes.